Okay, let's get started if that's okay with all of our speakers. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's virtual event hosted by the Clark Art Institute. My name is Rachel Cruz, and I'm the Public Programs Coordinator here at the Clark. And I'm excited to have you with us for this conversation on creating the first major monograph on artist Guillaume Lethière. Before we begin, I'd like to mention a few of our upcoming events. This Saturday, September 14th at 3 p.m., the esteemed Haitian American author and novelist Edwidge Danticat will discuss the challenges of telling Caribbean history and creating art while in exile from Haiti. She will be joined by Yale Professor of African American History, Kayama Glover. The following weekend, on September 21st at 11 a.m., we invite you to join Chrissy Pichachero, who's an associate professor of modern and classical languages at George Mason University, who will connect Guillaume Lethière to his contemporary Joseph Boulogne, exploring themes of race and celebrity in 18th and early 19th century France. Finally, on September 27th, the Clark will be holding the Guillaume Lethière Symposium, which is a full-day event celebrating the artist's career with scholars from around the world. All these programs further explore the themes surrounding Guillaume Lethière's work, as well as his life and legacy, much like today's event, which takes us behind the scenes of creating his monograph. Our speakers, Roy Brooks, Anne Roecklein, and Sophie Kerwin, will share their journey from concept to the completion of the 432-page, 8-pound catalog. I'd now like to pass things over to my colleague, Kevin Bicknell, the Clark's publication editor, who will introduce our speakers in more detail.
Thank you so much, Rachel. So as Rachel said, I'm Kevin Bicknell. I'm an editor here in the publications department at the Clark, and I'm thrilled to be here with three wonderful panelists who are gonna just walk through their parts in this incredible catalog. And as you'll learn as we go through this, Guillaume Lethière was really a towering figure whose name comes up a lot in discussions of art history and discussions of this time period. But oddly enough, there was no monograph on Guillaume Lethière himself, which is part of what makes this book so monumental and important. And yeah, I'd like to think that all of our projects are monumental, but this one is especially so in that it fills that gap in the scholarship. And this catalog really helps the exhibition live on past its time here at the Clark and brings it to audiences who might not be able to make it here or to the Louvre, which is where it's traveling next. So I would like to now introduce our panelists today. We have Sophie Kerwin with us. Sophie was the Curatorial Assistant for Painting and Sculpture at the Clark during the development and realization of this exhibition and catalog. She's now beginning her PhD in Art History and Material Culture at the Bard Graduate Center in New York City. We also have Roy Brooks. Roy operates the graphic design studio Fold 4, which is based in Chapel Hill, North Carolina. He specializes in designing illustrated books for institutions large and small across the United States. Roy is an essential partner to the Clark and has worked with us on several books in the past. Most recently, before this, I believe our Rodin in the United States catalog, we worked with Roy. And as you'll see, he's just an incredible creative thinker and thoughtful person. Finally, we have Anne Roecklein, who is the managing editor here in the publications department at the Clark. She's worked in various roles in publishing for nearly 20 years now and has led the Clark's publications efforts for around 12 years. So thankfully, you will not have to listen to me for the next hour exclusively, but I'll be keeping an eye on the chat. If you have questions, please put them in there. We'll wait till the end of the presentations to open it up to questions. And I look forward to hearing from our panelists. So without further ado, I will hand it over to Sophie.
Thank you so much, Kevin, for that introduction. And I'm excited to be joining you all virtually from New York in order to talk about this wonderful exhibition and catalog. The exhibition is at the Clark now and will be until October, and then it will be traveling to the Louvre, our second venue in Paris, starting in November. And I am going to, there we go. I'm going to be talking through the conception, research, and writing stages of the catalog, so sort of the curatorial end of things before I pass it off to Roy and Anne to get into the design and production of the catalog as a physical book. And so for those of you who might not be familiar with the exhibition yet or had the chance to visit in person, I wanted to just give a brief summary of our journey in conceiving the exhibition. And I like to start with this image. So the exhibition is the first major monographic exhibition on the artist Guillaume Lethière, who's pictured here. And I like to start with this stately, commanding pencil portrait by Ingres, one of the great 19th century draftsmen and painters, because it was one of the first representations of Lethière that one of our co-curators of the exhibition, Esther Bell, the Clark, came across. And while she many years ago was working on an exhibition of Ingres drawings at the Morgan Library. And she was struck by this drawing because she didn't know who it represented. She wasn't familiar with Lethière at that time. And she found it surprising that someone who would have merited this beautiful, sensitive portrait by one of the great portraitists of the 19th century, that she was unfamiliar with him as a figure. And as she began to dig into his biography, she found that he had led this extraordinary life, that he was born in Guadeloupe in 1760, which was then a French colony. He was born to a white plantation owner and an enslaved woman of color. And at age 14, he traveled with his father to France, where he began to train and embarked on one of the incredibly successful career as a history painter, became one of the most important history painters in late 18th and early 19th century France. He was a rival of Jacques-Louis David. He was the director of the French Academy in Rome, one of the most important artistic institutions outside of France. And that is where Ingres drew this portrait of him. And so that was back in 2011 that Esther first came across this image of Lethière. And then several years ago, the Clark had the opportunity to acquire this oil sketch of Lethière's, of one of his most famous and violent neoclassical subjects, Brutus condemning his sons to death, the finished painting of which is at the Louvre today. And then shortly after, to also acquire this landscape album assembled by one of Lethière's students from the contents of his studio that contains an extraordinary number of landscapes, of architectural drawings, of botanical studies, and so really is one of the largest repositories of Lethière's known drawings. And it was the acquisition of these works that really jump-started the conception of the exhibition at the Clark. So that was around 5 years ago that we began to jump into the research. And of course, we started with the existing research, and the foundational text on Lethière is what I'm showing on the screen here. It's a French dissertation written by the art historian Geneviève Capy in 1997. And she gives a great overview of his life and a catalog of his known works. But seeing as this was the only really authoritative text on Lethière, and it's from 1997, there was quite a bit of archival and original research that needed to happen for us to get a greater understanding of Lethière's biography and of his corpus. So to give you just a sense of some of that research, original research that me and my curatorial colleagues performed. It often involves flipping through, searching through what can be dry, administrative, bureaucratic documents until you find traces of your subject. And then slowly we're able to piece together an exciting life journey. And so one of the elements that remained murky in our understanding of Lethière's biography was his origins in Guadeloupe and his early life there. And it was through maps like the ones I'm showing here, drawn up by French cartographic engineers in the 1760s, around the time of Lethière's birth, that we were able to locate the plantation, the sugar plantation that his father owned and on which he was likely raised. And so in the detailed image here, you see the Bourg de Saint-Anne, the neighborhood of Saint-Anne, where he was from, and the sugar plantation was just outside of it. We were able to find through the help of colleagues, and I'll pause to just say that the realization of an exhibition and catalog of this nature really depends on a robust research community. So we many times have benefited from the help and aid of other scholars who specialize or whose specialties lie outside of our own. So this is something that a colleague shared with us, this incredible archaeological study from the 90s of the Guillaume plantation, of Lethière's father's plantation, detailing its entire history up until the 20th century. And it's located here on, or it's locating it precisely on the map here. It detailed the successive sales and owners, even giving lists of the enslaved people that were present at the plantation on at any given time. And it's through those archaeological documents that we were made aware that there were still remnants of the plantation today, which operated as a plantation for a long time and then a sugar distillery. But on the left, you see one of the images of one of the archival photographs of a windmill on the plantation. And on the right, you see a cell phone image that my co-curators Esther Bell and Olivier Millet on their trip to Guadeloupe were able to see the windmill at a distance in Guadeloupe today. Lethière's birth is notably absent from the parish records of St. Anne, where he was born and where you would expect to find it. So here I've included the page from 1760 where you'd expect to see his name, but it's absent. And this might indicate that he was born enslaved, as the birth and marriage and death records of enslaved people were recorded separately. But frustratingly still, that absence means that we're missing the kind of key details of what his mother's status was at the time of his birth. So We are able, however, through digging through many of these parish records to find later references to his mother and his sister who stayed in Guadeloupe, in which they are referred to as women of color, as mixed race women. And we were able to gather some details of their later lives. We were able to chart Lethière's journey to France at age 14 through the ship log that you see at right. It's only his father who's mentioned, which I've included a detail of here, Pierre Guillaume. And the ship that they took, the L'Éveillé, is actually visible in this contemporary painting in the foreground left. And then once Lethière arrives in France, we're able to track his career, training, and then establishing himself as an artist. And so here, for instance, we have the first record of him as enrolling in the Académie Royale de Peinture et Sculpture, or the Royal Academy of Painting in Paris in 1778. And we're lucky in the case of Lethière, it's not just these sort of bureaucratic documents through which we can piece together his life, but we also are lucky to have a good number of letters of his personal correspondence, both from his time as the director of the French Academy, and then also this remarkable cache of documents that are in the Archives Nationales in France that relate to his legal recognition by his father as his son. And they contain these incredibly emotive letters written between father and son about their history, their relationship, his hopes for his son's future. And so we were able, through this sort of research, to really get a sense of Lethière's life and biography. And then the other major piece is, of course, reconstructing his corpus, his body of work, from his earliest student drawings, which I've shown an example of at top left, through all the way to his best known masterpieces at the bottom right. And some of these are in well-known institutions today, and so are easy to track down. And others have passed through private hands and have been on the art market, or are in storage in smaller regional museums, and involved quite a bit of tracking down. Again, this very much relies on a community of scholars and art historians, and also dealers and curators, and continually knocking on doors persistently in order to find things, to figure out where they are today. And then also, since this is really the first, this was going to be the first exhibition and the first catalog to record, to bring together this corpus of work by Lethière, we also wanted to detail the history of each of these works individually from the moment of their creation up to the present day. So their history of ownership, their history of exhibition, and their history in scholarship. So every reference to them in the literature. And in some cases that involves uncovering some really interesting stories. So this painting, The Oath of the Ancestors, which is a remarkable painting of Lethière's celebrating Haitian independence. Lethière sent his his middle son, Auguste Lethière, to deliver the painting to Haiti in person. And we were able to find the ship manifest that recorded his passage to Haiti, and is annotated saying that he'd been given a pass to travel by the president of Haiti, to whom he delivered the painting. So it's these kind of incredibly exciting and revelatory pieces of research that had been working on for around 5 years, also reconstructing the larger Caribbean circle to which he was a part, which involved teasing out connections and then also finding objects that represented that Caribbean community, as represented in this slide. And that all of that research, years of research, then around 2 years ago, I would say, we began to think about how that would become a book. And so both how it began to exhibit on the one, or to think on the one hand about how it would be translated into an exhibition, and then how it would become a catalog, which, as Kevin said, is really the lasting record of the exhibition. And as we've mentioned several times, this is the first exhibition and catalog to focus solely on Lethière. So it was important to us that it be a real substantial scholarly catalog, something that was almost a catalog raisonné in the absence of that. And so that involved detailed entries on each of Lethière's works that were represented. And that would again include the exhibition history, the provenance, the bibliography for each work, beautiful photography so that that would be available to future scholars. And then we also wanted something that was new, though, because he had such an interesting place in this larger social history. We wanted something that reflected the incredibly interesting moment of history that he came out of, and the larger Caribbean context in which he worked. So that involved also enlisting outside authors whose specialties were outside of our own to contribute some really fantastic essays about the history of Guadeloupe at this moment, the history of Caribbean artists working in France, the representation of race in 18th and 19th century painting that give greater context to the individual story of Lethière that we were going to tell. And I think I can't remember, I think it's 14 contributors that we had all together, which is an enormous project to manage, and that is what Anne Roecklein is going to be talking about as our managing editor. And as we were beginning to visualize the catalog as a book and to write, we also began to think about it as a book, as a physical object. So I'm going to pass it off to Roy Brooks, our book designer, who can talk about how we began to translate that into a physical book.
Thank you, Sophie. Yes, so I was brought in to design the catalog, and I was able to visit the Clark. I guess it was about a little over a year ago when we kicked this phase of the project off. And through conversations with Sophie and the rest of the curatorial staff, these were descriptive words that I took away from the meeting that throughout the design process really helped me to frame what it was they were looking for. You know, they wanted a book that was substantial, that felt scholarly. They wanted a textbook or a tome, and yet they wanted something that was surprising and fresh and radical. And I think that last word, radical, was the hardest one for me to kind of wrap my head around. I think in this context, you know, it's really in reference to this idea of revolution. Whereas, in graphic design terms, radical can often mean something that, veers tremendously in form or conventions. And that wasn't necessarily what we were going for. I think, we were trying to strike this balance that, maintain an appropriately traditional tone while also feeling fresh. And while I was at the Clark, Anne Roecklein, who you will be hearing from next, she had the great idea of going to the Clark Library and reviewing just examples of books that were published in France from the late 18th, early 19th century. And so the librarians were kind enough to pull a bunch of books for us. And I took a lot of snapshots of details of these books to sort of refer back to later, just to start to put the time period into some sort of context. And, for me, the takeaways, are both the physical characteristics of these books, in particular, just the tactility, the texture of the paper. So many of them had leather bindings, as you can see here in the middle, and in rounded book spines, which are not as common in publishing today, but very common from the time. And then as well, looking at graphic elements that were commonly used, namely the exclusive use of serif typefaces, the use of rules to help organize the page, and then, the use of white space and ample margins. As Sophie mentioned, this is the landscape album that the Clark had acquired, and I was also able to see this during my time there. And just as an object, it became another touchstone for what we were creating with the book. In particular, I was drawn to the way it was bound, which is referred to a three-piece binding, where the spine is a different material than the cover boards, and also the title being stamped in gold, and again, that rounded spine. And at that point, in my design process, it really, I start to sift through all this accumulated information. And oftentimes that results in just making notes for myself in a sketchbook. Starting to think about how to actually extrapolate some visual form or some type of language from these amorphous ideas. And typically what happens is certain design ideas start to thread together, and they can suggest a larger framework that can help guide other aspects of the book's look and feel. So that can then lead to, looking at different typefaces, both for the display of the title and also for the running text, looking at scale and placement of type and color palettes and the materials, the paper, the binding, the type of binding, the page grids, how images and text relate to one another. And so I came back to the Clark sometime later with two distinct design schemes. The first of which really stemmed from this painting that you saw earlier that Sophie discussed, of Brutus condemning his sons. And this was one of the images that they, really were looking at as a possible cover. And to me, the red of the robe was such a strong focal point, and the idea of red speaking to this idea of revolution, this idea of, the book being radical, and not to mention the bloodshed. So the color red became a primary driver in this design scheme, to the point that the edges of the book itself would actually be painted red. This is a traditional technique that you've probably seen on early books. Oftentimes they are edge gilded in gold, but here, I proposed that it be red. And The dust jacket is also cropped short, so you have this simultaneity of both the image and the materials of the binding and the tactility of the cloth and the stamping. And here is would be the cloth cover minus the dust jacket. And the opening in sheet was a sketch of the same scene. The idea being to create this dialogue between the jacket and the opening of the book, and each one sort of capitalizing on the material that it's printed on, as in sheets are often more toothy, tactile papers, which would be appropriate for a work on paper such as this. And then that color red continues to be featured prominently with this full coverage into the title page and the contents. And this moves into showing examples of how the essays would be treated. And this was a very challenging catalog from a design perspective, particularly this section of the book that showcased the work itself, just because there was so much information that was being conveyed, both entry text, captions for the works, and then supporting apparatus, including the exhibition history and references to other publications and related works. So there was quite a bit of back and forth ultimately on how all of this would be reconciled, and how, first and foremost, how it can be made in a very legible format. This was showing an example of how the chronology would be treated, and using that same red ink to distinguish the different types of content within the chronology. And the second proposal, the other painting, as Sophie alluded to, that was very much in the discussion for the cover, was Oath of the Ancestors, which is a monumental work. The painting itself is over 10 feet tall. And so I wanted to do something with the typography, with the title of the book, that would play into that monumental quality of the work itself. And the fact that the title was simply the artist's name lent a bit more flexibility as far as being able to really scale the name up, and just, sort of the happy accident of Lethière's name, there being no descenders in the letter forms, so that you get this nice baseline that can be pushed against the right side of the book and really scaled up large to be very dramatic and somewhat unexpected at the same time. And the binding itself beneath the jacket, again, goes back to the landscape album, and a 3-piece binding here using an imitation leather, but stamped in gold foil. And details were another important aspect of both design schemes, and something that the curators were very interested in showcasing. So within this version, it also uses this orange, warm red accent color. And you can see it has a very rigid structure to it, using these rules that, again, sort of stemmed from other publications of the time period. And so this, the combination of the vertical rules, this columnar format, and the sort of overall geometric clarity were derived from neoclassical design motifs. So trying to create something that feels fresh, yet also scholarly. And again, going back to those first lists of words that, the takeaways from the initial meeting with the Clark. So it's now my pleasure to pass it on to Anne Roecklein at the Clark.
Okay, thank you, Roy, and hello, everyone. Let's see. I am delighted to be part of this panel today and to share some of the behind the scenes work that went into making a book like this. My work really begins after the curatorial goals of the book have been defined. I help put the book team together. I develop and manage the overall project schedule and budget. Our department handles intellectual property and copyright issues. And then we get into helping with text development, editing, design management, proofreading, production management, and distribution. And I'll talk a little bit about each of these stages. So I'm kind of going back to the beginning and to the end of the book. And this work is very interdepartmental, iterative, and collaborative. And we'll jump right in with editing, which is really the nexus of the work of our department. And we apply kind of national guides like the Chicago Manual of Style, field-specific resources like the Association of Art Editor Style Guide, and then we collaborate both internally and externally to set specific styles for projects, individual projects like this one. Don't try to read anything on this slide. This is our editorial tracking spreadsheet. That's not even the whole thing, but this is just showing that we had about 121 different text files, about half of which first needed to go through both translation and translation editing. And then all of the texts went through at least 3 rounds of editing in English. And this whole process took around 6 months. And both the translation and editing process on this book were especially nuanced and fascinating. You know, for example, I remember one day when the volume editors and translators and editors, we were all talking about the nuanced difference between translating a kind of archaic French term to either I will or I shall. And that's just an example of how kind of how nuanced and the attention to detail that went into the whole project. For the editing rounds, initially we worked primarily electronically, either in Word files, track changes, or an electronic markup on PDFs, which is what you see on the left side of the screen here. But in later proofreading rounds, we also try to work deliberately making hand marks on paper. Studies have shown that when you read on screen versus on paper, it gets processed in slightly different areas of the brain. So we try to keep both of those processes to catch as many errors as possible. And I can add here that, of course, language and editing are social and fluid practices. And so this work is always evolving and taking into consideration a lot of different contexts, which was especially important on a book like this with authors from lots of different countries working in different languages. When we're editing and proofreading, we're not just dotting I's and crossing T's. We're also looking at the layout and making sure that all the different elements are really working well together. For example, image sizing and placement. The image on the left of the screen shows a day that when we put out all of the large details that we had in the book, just to make sure that that flow was making sense. And the picture on the right shows the evening before we were transferring the entire book file to the printer. And this is our in-house team. We had a late night pizza party to check the last couple hundred corrections in the book. Of course, publications like this are not just text. It's a visual artist, of course. And so we work very hard to source the best possible images and then work to make sure that those are the most accurate and appealing in reproduction as they can be. So we adjust color and other qualities like contrast, saturation, and cropping. So just as texts go through multiple rounds of edits, the images go through around three rounds of proofing and adjustments. In the upper left of this screen, you'll see our in-house light table. This is the same kind of light table that printers use, so we can make sure that we're reviewing images in the same kinds of light conditions. we'll come back to this idea. The image on the top right shows some color proofs that we were able to take into some of the Clark's art storage areas and compare the proofs to actual images and then make correcting notations here. The image on the lower left shows a file of a painting that was originally provided that was too cold and had too many, it sort of highlighted the craquelure, the cracks on the surface of the painting. So we actually found a photographer in Paris who could reshoot a new image for this painting. And then the image on the right shows sadly, no one from the book team had seen this image, the cover image, in person. And so we didn't have a lot of information to go on for how to make sure that it looks most accurate. So here we are comparing our color proof to a previously published reproduction that was published by the institution that holds this work. So these are just a variety of different ways that we work on images in particular. There are many kind of magical moments in making a book, but one of them that I especially love is when a book starts to go from an elaborate plan to being a tangible object that you can interact with. And so we really engaged with designers and printers on material selection. And the upper left of this slide shows the various paper colors and textures that we were looking at to cover the book boards. The lower left shows some different ink colors that we tested as a spot color, and we're looking at those with the light blue end papers. This swatch shows the different materials we tested for the spine material. This is a sustainable faux leather that I believe is made out of silk. And this is then the binding dummy that the printer made so that we could test and approve our material choices. So starting here, I am now at the printer, and we worked here with a company called Verona Libri in northern Italy, which is an area rich in manufacturing history, and particularly has a lot of fabulous art book printers. We go on what's called on press or press checks to make sure that the printing goes as planned. And I can just say big picture wise, contemporary commercial printing, specifically offset lithography, is not just a matter of hitting like a big red print button and then the book comes out perfectly on the other side, but there's varying standards in the industry, which results in some printers specializing in this kind of project. And there's just an incredible amount of craft that goes into it, and ultimately a lot of subjectivity as well. So on the left, we are looking at some of the very last editorial checks, and on the right, the planning and scheduling documents for how the book would be going through the printers. This machine creates the metal printing plates. So each sheet of paper that goes through the press has 8 pages on one side and then 8 pages on the other side. And each of those pages gets printed with 4 colors, cyan, magenta, yellow, and black. And together, these ink colors use optical mixing to make most of the other colors, with the exception of the red spot color that we also added as another plate. So on this plate that's coming out of the machine, you see dark areas. That's the images and the text, and that is where ink sticks to those dark areas, and where it's light, ink gets repelled, and then ink gets transferred to the paper. We'll see more of that. So you'll remember the light table earlier that we had here at the Clark. This is a similar light table, but at the printer, and similar in that we're using the same color temperature. What we're looking at here is the process called make ready, where the printer and the press start running through sheets, and then we check those sheets to make sure that the sheet is printing as we want. And so if you look closely here, this here is the printed sheet, and then what's right here is the approved color proof. So we're comparing those to make sure what we approved and what we're looking for is what's showing up on the sheet. And once we like the sheets, we print it. And then, that's 4,000 or 5,000 sheets going through the press. That gets monitored by both the press electronically as well as the press operators. And what you see on this up here, these are sensors that are monitoring ink density to make sure that things stay consistent across the run. This is a video that shows the whole press from start to finish, which is about the size of a semi-truck. So pallets of blank paper get loaded into one end, the sheets run under where that person is standing on, that's where the ink comes down, and they get printed, and then they come out the end where they're dried, flipped, then printed on the reverse side, dried again, and prepared for the binding process. Okay, I'm sorry, it looks like some of the videos got a little glitchy here, but I'm gonna advance. Oops, okay, sorry. This is showing paper being fed into the front of the press. Presses like this can print about 14 to 18,000 sheets per hour. Printers tend to run on the slower end for finer art books like this, and the humidity of the paper needs to be very controlled so nothing gets stuck. Next, we're going to look at the top of the press. Let's see. These are showing the ink wells that the ink gets fed into. And these are some videos of a press operator adding ink into those ink wells. I don't have a lot to say on these, but it's just sometimes I'm just struck by how beautiful the process is and how that blue looks like icing or something like that. Oh, and this is the end of the press with sheets coming out that then get stacked here and ready for the bindery. Some printers tend to have binding capabilities in-house. Most tend to work with another company, and that's what we did here. Let's see. Oh, okay, so this slide is showing some of the various golds that we tested for this beautiful book. On the top left are different gold foils that we use to stamp. Well, we tested those and picked one to stamp both the case and the spine. So the case has paper, but the spine has the faux leather. So you need to find one that can work on both of those. And then the other images are showing different gold inks that we looked at and tested for the jacket. And so you could think, oh, gold is just gold, but there's a lot of nuances. We were looking to make sure that all these golds would work together and with the images and the rest of the book. Binding, there's a lot of steps in binding, and I'll go through this quickly. None of the pictures on this screen are actually of the Lethière book, but they show some of the steps that the project went through. The sheets need to get folded in a very specific way so that they end up in the correct order. They're sewn and glued together and then cased into the bookcase. Then the jacket gets wrapped on. The books get individually shrink wrapped, and we were the first first client to use recyclable shrink wrap with this printer and this binder. Then they get packed, palletized, and shipped. And now the book is ready to go out into the world, and Clark books pretty much go everywhere. We have on-site sales. This is the book in our store here. We have online sales. This is the Clark's website. And then we work with Yale University Press for worldwide distribution. So this book went to warehouses in both London and New Haven. And if you see a Clark book, or this book in particular, at Amazon or independent bookstores, it has gone through the Yale University Press distribution channel. And then very excitingly, this book, the next partner is the Louvre, and they are producing a French edition. So up here is an early, this will be done soon, but it's a page showing if you want to read it in French, that will be coming out soon. And then we wanted to show some pictures of the finished book. So there's just a lot of process and collaboration that goes into a project like this, more people than I can possibly thank. I remember being on press and starting to see this book really accumulate, and I was struck by the power of the images and how those were accentuated by the incredible content and design. And I know that Roy wanted to talk a little bit about the finished book. And then, of course, we want to save a few minutes for questions. So let's see, I'll keep flipping through here. But Roy wanted to talk about how the two design methods kind of merge together.
Sure, just briefly. I think one amazing thing about this book is that if you notice, the final jacket and the binding ended up being identical to the presentation that I gave to the Clark originally. So that doesn't always happen. Sometimes there's a lot of back and forth or second guessing on cover images, that sort of thing. But here they really everyone was happy with this direction, and this is what it became. And beyond that, into the interior of the book, there was a lot of back and forth, as I alluded to in my previous discussion, particularly in how this catalog section would work and how these various types of content would come together. And ultimately, the book really was a fusion of the two versions that I shared. It uses a red spot color throughout, kind of back to this idea of revolution and bloodshed, and then also maintains the vertical rules and the sort of geometric qualities that gives it this neoclassical feel.
Well, thank you so much to our panelists here. It's just been fascinating to watch this go from beginning to what it is now out in the world. Let's go ahead and open it up to questions. So please feel free to send questions, and I will direct them to the correct person. So first one, maybe this is a question for Anne. You mentioned the printer in Verona. How do you go about choosing a printer for a certain project?
Sure, that's a great question. I think part of it has to do that just when you're around this industry for a while, you start to get to know printers and what they specialize in, and different printers have different capabilities in-house. Then part of it is cost. We always send bids out to multiple printers, and then we look at the costs, both domestically and internationally. And then also sustainability factored in. One of the tipping points that led us to Verona Libri was that we decided to work with a certain paper that's made about 45 minutes away from where this printer was. So we are, by working with a paper that's made right down the road, we're cutting out some of the kind of waste that can happen in the industry. So there's a lot of factors that add up, and it's one of the, I think, more fascinating parts of the job.
Thank you. Next question looks like this might be actually one for everybody, but maybe we could start with, well, I'll just throw it out there and we'll see. We saw the multiple cover options. Could you talk a little bit more about the discussions that went into choosing those images, or even the final image? I don't know who would want to start that. Maybe Sophie?
Sure, I'm happy to talk about that. Yeah, so in general, whenever we work on an exhibition project, the Clark or at other institutions, we think about what are the signature images for a given exhibition, what images really best represent the exhibition for our publics. And pretty quickly, we narrowed in on a few really powerful works by Lethière. One, and I think this was partly because this is a project that came out of the Clark, was the oil sketch of Brutus condemning his sons to death, which was one that we or that was acquired by the Clark, and is also one of a pendant of one of the most important, one of two paintings that are considered the most important paintings of Lethière's career, and that came to define his reputation for a long time after as well. And then the other painting which we selected and is the cover image is Oath of the Ancestors. And it really is a painting apart in Lethière's oeuvre. It is, as I mentioned, this celebration of Haitian independence, and ultimately we thought that that was the best encapsulated the many of the themes in the exhibition that we wanted to highlight. Lethière's place of origin in the Caribbean, and his political and social ties to the Caribbean after moving to France and continuing into his career. And it's a fantastically powerful image as well.
Thank you, Sophie. We have another question here. This one's for Anne. What was or it could actually be for Roy too. What was the decisive reason behind the preferred paper that we ended up printing this book on?
We wanted a paper that was very smooth, so that the Lethière has a very fine quality to his painting, and we wanted that to show to best advantage. And wanted a nice kind of drape to the paper and feel, and then selecting papers and printing kind of go hand in hand, because it can be easier to get certain papers if you're printing in Europe, and easier to get, or other parts of the world, easier to get certain papers if you're printing domestically. So it just some of these decisions start to kind of intertwine. But Roy might have we also looked at color too, just like the gold isn't gold, white isn't white. There's so many versions of slightly warm, slightly cool, slightly cream, something like that. And we were looking at just a hair side of neutral toward warm to go, but still staying pretty neutral, because Lethière's palette is already quite warm.
Thank you very much, Anne. We're coming up on 1 o'clock here, so I think we probably have time for maybe one more question, if anyone has one. Anne, a question for you, and it again could be a question for Roy. There's a lot of design questions. You showed the I think it was the metal sheet, the plate with the eight pages on it. What if your book doesn't end up on 8 pages? What if it doesn't fill that entirely? What do you do?
Sure. When you're making a book with signatures, that means gathered pages that are in kind of a they're collected together and they're sewn together in groups. Those signatures are done usually in groups of 16 pages. So that's 8 sheets of paper that fold and wrap to make 16 pages. Or you can cut that number in half. You can do 4 sheets that make 8 pages, or so on. You can keep cutting in half 2 sheets that make 4 pages, or even 1 sheet that makes 2 pages. But when you start to make signatures smaller and then you're sewing them together, that can put different amounts of stress on those pages, because if you can just think about the geometry there, I think that's a great view. All of these signatures are even. Actually, no, I think we have 2 halves in here somewhere, but you don't really want to drop down lower than 8 because of some of the stresses that can end up there. And so that gives a designer like Roy an opportunity to help us balance out pages, like think about where to break text, how small or large individual images could be so that we fill the next page, things like that. That's some of the nuance and the brilliance that Roy brings to laying out a book like this, is making sure that it falls either on a 16 or an 8.
Yeah, I think it's something that you need to be mindful of, from the outset of the project. And, to the degree that, we sometimes will put together book maps and, really figure out how many words are we getting per page with a given text setting? How many images do we have? So yeah, just really fleshing it out as the book develops and just being mindful of where things are falling, because personally, I find it, very, very problematic when you get to the end of a book and there's just a series of blank pages. It feels like such a wasted moment to me. So I think just keeping it in mind from the outset and just letting that be part of what's guiding the process.
Thank you both. It's a little bit of a puzzle. All right, so any last questions before we wrap this up? All right, well, on that note then, I'll just thank our panelists once again, and just put in a plug for all you folks watching to keep an eye out for upcoming Clark publications. It's something that we love to do here at the Clark and we feel is important. And as you can see there, it's a really interesting process to put them together that involves a huge team for everything. So thank you, everybody, and enjoy the rest of your Thursday afternoon.